There is a quiet, uncomfortable question many people eventually find themselves asking after enough confusion accumulates within a relationship marked by avoidant inconsistency. A question that sounds almost too painful to say out loud. Am I actually the one they want? Or am I simply the safe option they keep around while something else remains possible in the back of their mind? Today, we are going to examine this question honestly, walking through the actual behavioral differences that tend to distinguish genuine primary attachment from a more peripheral, backup style connection within avoidant psychology, so you can evaluate your own situation with considerably more clarity than confusion alone could ever provide. Let's begin by acknowledging something important before going further, because this entire topic risks reinforcing a painful, sometimes inaccurate narrative if handled carelessly. Avoidant withdrawal itself, the pulling away, the inconsistency, the difficulty with sustained closeness, occurs across genuine primary relationships just as frequently as it occurs within more peripheral connections. This means inconsistency alone does not confirm you occupy a backup position. What actually distinguishes genuine primary attachment from something more peripheral involves considerably more specific, more observable patterns worth examining carefully, rather than concluding backup status simply because confusion or distance exists. Let's talk about the first meaningful distinction worth observing: the presence or absence of genuine effort during moments of low stakes, ordinary interaction. Someone genuinely valued as a primary attachment tends to receive attention and initiative even when nothing particular requires it. Messages sent simply because a thought arose. Plans suggested without any specific occasion prompting them. Curiosity about ordinary daily details that carry no dramatic weight. Someone occupying a more peripheral, backup position tends to receive attention primarily during moments of loneliness, moments of boredom, or moments when other options have become temporarily unavailable. Attention that surges during these specific windows and recedes considerably once those particular conditions change. Let's talk about why this distinction proves so revealing, because the underlying psychology here deserves careful explanation. Genuine primary attachment, even within someone carrying significant avoidant patterns, typically involves the person occupying at least some space within their ongoing, unprompted thinking. Thoughts that surface during ordinary moments unrelated to any specific need or specific circumstance. Backup positioning, by contrast, tends to exist primarily within a functional, need-based framework, activated specifically when a particular gap requires filling, receding once that gap has been temporarily addressed through your attention or your presence. Let's talk about a second meaningful distinction: the willingness to introduce someone into wider social or family contexts. Genuine primary attachment, even amid considerable avoidant hesitancy around commitment language or relationship labels, often still includes gradual integration into broader life, introductions to friends, mentions to family, inclusion within social gatherings that extend beyond the two of you specifically. Backup positioning tends to remain considerably more compartmentalized, kept separate from these wider social contexts, existing within a more private, more contained space that never quite extends into the fuller architecture of their daily life. Let's talk about why this compartmentalization occurs so consistently within backup dynamics specifically, because understanding the motivation clarifies why this pattern deserves particular attention. Keeping someone compartmentalized, separate from wider social integration, preserves flexibility, allowing continued access to that connection without the accountability that broader social visibility would create. Genuine primary attachment, even when inconsistent in other ways, typically involves less concern about this particular kind of flexibility preservation, because the underlying commitment, however imperfectly expressed, does not require the same careful management of visibility and access. Let's talk about a third distinction worth examining closely: the specific pattern of communication timing, particularly regarding who initiates contact and under what circumstances that initiation tends to occur. Genuine primary attachment often includes reasonably balanced initiation, both people reaching out relatively proportionally, even if one party carries more general avoidant hesitancy overall. Backup positioning frequently involves considerably skewed initiation, communication that arrives almost exclusively when you reach out first, or alternatively, communication that arrives from them specifically during predictable windows, late evenings, weekends when other plans have fallen through, timing that suggests convenience rather than genuine, spontaneous desire for connection. Let's talk about a fourth distinction: the presence or absence of genuine vulnerability shared during difficult or stressful periods in their own life. Someone occupying genuine primary attachment status, even within considerable avoidant guardedness, often eventually becomes at least one of the people turned toward during significant personal difficulty: a job loss, a family crisis, a health concern. Backup positioning frequently excludes this kind of access entirely. Difficult periods navigated privately or with other, more established connections, while your presence remains reserved primarily for lighter, lower stakes interaction that never quite extends into their genuinely vulnerable moments. Let's talk about a fifth distinction worth naming directly: how they respond specifically when you express a need or a concern about the relationship's direction. Genuine primary attachment, even amid avoidant discomfort, tends to produce some engagement with these concerns. Discomfort, perhaps, defensiveness, perhaps, but still some attempt at addressing what you have raised rather than complete dismissal or complete deflection. Backup positioning often produces a considerably different response: minimization, vague reassurance that resolves nothing concrete, or subtle redirection that changes the subject entirely rather than genuinely engaging with the concern you have expressed. Let's talk about what this pattern reveals about the underlying stakes involved from their perspective, because understanding motivation here matters considerably. When someone occupies genuine primary importance, losing that connection typically carries real, felt consequence, motivating at least some effort toward addressing concerns, even if that effort remains imperfect or inconsistent. When someone occupies a more peripheral backup position, the stakes of losing that connection register considerably lower, reducing motivation toward the kind of effort that addressing concerns genuinely requires. Let's talk about a sixth distinction: the specific quality of physical affection and its context, worth examining honestly, though it requires particular care and nuance. Genuine primary attachment often includes physical affection that extends beyond purely private, purely sexual contexts: casual touch during ordinary daily activities, affection offered in public or semi-public settings, physical closeness that exists independent of specifically intimate moments. Backup positioning frequently confines physical affection almost entirely to private, often specifically sexual contexts, with considerably less casual, ordinary physical warmth present during other kinds of shared time together. Let's talk about what to do with this entire framework once you have honestly applied it to your own specific situation, because recognition alone does not resolve anything without subsequent action informed by what you have observed. If multiple distinctions throughout this discussion consistently point toward backup positioning rather than genuine primary attachment, this pattern deserves serious, honest consideration rather than continued hopeful dismissal. Backup positioning rarely resolves into genuine primary attachment simply through continued patience or continued increased effort on your part, because the underlying dynamic reflects their own choice regarding where genuine investment gets directed, a choice that your continued patience typically does not have significant power to change. Let's talk about what genuine self-respect requires once this pattern has been honestly recognized. Self-respect that sometimes means directly naming what you have observed, offering them genuine opportunity to address it honestly, while remaining prepared for the possibility that this direct naming does not produce the shift you might be hoping for. This conversation deserves to be approached calmly, factually, describing specific patterns you have noticed rather than launching into accusation, creating space for honest response while still maintaining your own clarity about what continued backup positioning would mean for your own future within this dynamic. Let's talk about what happens if, despite this direct conversation, the pattern remains fundamentally unchanged over meaningful subsequent time. This outcome, painful as it is, provides genuinely important information, confirmation that continued investment likely will not produce the primary positioning you deserve within genuine partnership. Honoring this information, rather than continuing to hope indefinitely that patience alone will eventually shift a dynamic that has already revealed itself clearly through repeated, consistent pattern, represents an important act of self-protection. Let's talk about the specific danger of applying this framework too rigidly, treating every single instance of inconsistency or every single missed opportunity for social integration as definitive proof of backup status, when genuine avoidant hesitancy, entirely separate from backup positioning, can produce some similar surface behaviors without indicating the same underlying dynamic. This distinction matters considerably because someone genuinely committed to you as their primary attachment can still struggle significantly with public displays of commitment, still struggle with introducing you to family, still struggle with vulnerability, purely due to their own avoidant patterns, rather than due to you occupying a secondary backup role. Evaluating the overall pattern across multiple distinctions, rather than fixating on any single behavior in isolation, provides considerably more accurate assessment than any single data point could offer alone. Let's talk about what remains true, regardless of which category your own specific relationship ultimately falls into once this honest evaluation has been completed. You deserve to be someone's genuine primary consideration, not their convenient backup option, activated during moments of loneliness or moments when other possibilities have temporarily receded. This standard is not excessive or unreasonable. It represents the basic foundation genuine partnership actually requires, and settling for less, however understandable given genuine care and genuine hope, ultimately costs you considerably more than the discomfort of honestly recognizing where you currently stand within this particular dynamic. Let's talk about a seventh distinction worth examining: the specific way future planning gets discussed, or avoided, between genuine primary attachment and backup positioning. Someone genuinely valued as a primary partner, even amid avoidant discomfort with commitment language specifically, often still engages with future-oriented conversation in some form, mentioning upcoming events they hope to share, referencing you within loosely sketched future plans, even if those plans remain deliberately vague. Backup positioning frequently involves near total avoidance of any future-oriented reference, conversation that remains firmly anchored in the present moment, with any attempt on your part to discuss future plans met with deflection, vague non-committal responses, or outright discomfort that shuts the conversation down entirely. Let's talk about why this particular pattern proves so revealing, because future-oriented language, however minor or however hedged, requires at least some willingness to imagine you occupying space within their life, beyond the immediate present. Someone who cannot tolerate even loose, hypothetical future reference involving you specifically is often communicating something significant about how they currently categorize the relationship internally, regardless of what they might explicitly claim if asked directly. Let's talk about an eighth distinction: the specific way they handle your own boundaries and your own stated needs when those needs create genuine inconvenience for them. Genuine primary attachment tends to produce at least some willingness to adjust behavior, even imperfectly, in response to your clearly stated needs. Evidence that your well-being carries real weight within their decision-making, even when that weight competes with their own preferences or their own comfort. Backup positioning frequently produces considerably less accommodation. Your needs acknowledged perhaps verbally, but rarely translated into actual behavioral adjustment, particularly whenever meeting those needs would require genuine inconvenience or genuine sacrifice on their part. Let's talk about a ninth distinction worth naming directly: how consistently they remember and reference details from your own life, your own interests, your own ongoing circumstances. Genuine primary attachment typically includes accumulated knowledge that builds naturally over time, references to something you mentioned weeks earlier, genuine interest in following up on situations you had previously shared. Backup positioning often involves a strange, persistent superficiality, conversations that never quite deepen into genuine, accumulated familiarity with your ongoing life, as though each interaction exists somewhat isolated from what came before, rather than building toward the kind of layered intimacy genuine primary connection typically develops over time. Let's talk about a 10th and final distinction worth examining: the specific pattern of jealousy or protectiveness they display regarding your own other relationships or your own other romantic possibilities. Genuine primary attachment, even within considerable avoidant guardedness, frequently still includes at least some evidence of this protectiveness. Questions about who you have been spending time with, subtle discomfort at the mention of other romantic interest, evidence that losing access to you specifically would register as genuine loss rather than as simple inconvenience. Backup positioning often lacks this protectiveness almost entirely. Apparent indifference toward whatever else you might be doing or whoever else you might be seeing. Indifference that reflects the lower overall stakes your specific presence carries within their broader emotional landscape. Let's talk about what it means to weigh all 10 of these distinctions together, rather than treating any single one as definitive on its own, because genuine clarity emerges from the overall pattern rather than from isolated instances that might carry alternative explanations. A relationship showing consistent evidence across most or all of these distinctions pointing toward genuine primary attachment, even amid considerable avoidant inconsistency in other respects, likely reflects genuine, if complicated, commitment worth continuing to navigate patiently. A relationship showing consistent evidence across most or all of these distinctions pointing toward backup positioning deserves considerably more serious reconsideration, regardless of how much genuine affection or genuine chemistry might exist alongside that peripheral status. Let's talk about the specific emotional experience of conducting this kind of honest evaluation, because the process itself often proves genuinely difficult, regardless of what conclusion it ultimately reveals. There is a natural temptation to interpret ambiguous evidence charitably, searching for explanations that support the more hopeful conclusion, rather than confronting a less comfortable but potentially more accurate assessment. Approaching this evaluation with genuine honesty, rather than motivated reasoning designed to protect continued hope, requires real courage. Courage worth acknowledging directly, given how uncomfortable this kind of clear-eyed self-honesty genuinely proves to be. Let's talk about what specific support might help you conduct this evaluation more objectively than you might manage entirely alone, given how easily personal investment can cloud accurate assessment of one's own relationship. Trusted friends who know both you and the situation, offering outside perspective unclouded by your own hope or your own emotional investment, can provide valuable additional insight. Written reflection, listing specific examples across each of these distinctions rather than relying purely on general impression, often reveals patterns more clearly than memory alone tends to provide, since memory frequently gets shaped by whatever emotional state currently dominates, rather than by accurate, comprehensive recall. Let's talk about what genuine compassion for yourself requires throughout this entire evaluation process, regardless of whatever conclusion it ultimately produces. If this honest assessment reveals backup positioning rather than genuine primary attachment, this discovery does not reflect poor judgment or excessive naivety on your part. Avoidant dynamics specifically create considerable confusion, mixing genuine affection with genuine inconsistency in ways that make accurate assessment genuinely difficult, particularly while still emotionally invested within the relationship itself. Extending yourself genuine compassion for having taken this long to see the pattern clearly, rather than harsh self-criticism for not recognizing it sooner, supports healthier processing of whatever comes next. Let's talk about what happens to genuine self-worth over time when someone remains within backup positioning for extended periods without recognizing or addressing the pattern directly. Prolonged backup positioning tends to produce a particular corrosive kind of self-doubt, a gradual erosion of confidence in one's own value, since the relationship structure itself repeatedly communicates, however unintentionally, that genuine primary consideration belongs elsewhere or remains permanently unavailable. Recognizing this erosion honestly, rather than continuing to minimize its impact, represents an important part of understanding why addressing backup positioning directly, rather than tolerating it indefinitely, genuinely matters for long-term psychological well-being. Let's talk about the specific role hope plays in sustaining backup positioning far longer than the actual evidence would otherwise support. Hope that the current arrangement represents merely a temporary phase destined to evolve naturally into genuine primary attachment, given sufficient patience. This hope, while understandable, deserves careful scrutiny regarding whether it rests on genuine evidence of gradual positive change or whether it persists purely through wishful projection, disconnected from the relationship's actual observable trajectory. Distinguishing between hope grounded in real evidence and hope sustained purely through emotional investment protects against extending backup positioning indefinitely based on possibility alone rather than genuine demonstrated movement. Let's talk about what it means to communicate your discovery of this pattern honestly, should you choose direct conversation as your next step. Communication that deserves careful framing in order to produce genuine dialogue rather than immediate defensiveness. Rather than presenting an exhaustive list of every distinction discussed throughout this conversation, focusing on the 2 or 3 patterns that feel most significant and most clearly demonstrated within your specific situation tends to produce more productive conversation than an overwhelming, comprehensive accusation might generate. This focused approach allows genuine engagement with the most important concerns, rather than triggering complete shutdown in response to feeling exhaustively cataloged and criticized. Let's talk about what specific response from them, following this kind of honest conversation, would genuinely indicate willingness to shift toward primary positioning, rather than simply offering temporary reassurance designed to reduce immediate conflict. Genuine willingness typically includes specific, concrete commitment, actual plans for social integration rather than vague promises, actual initiation of future-oriented conversation rather than continued deflection, sustained change extended across weeks and months rather than a brief improvement immediately following the conversation that gradually fades once the immediate discomfort of being confronted has passed. Let's talk about what remains available to you specifically once you have completed this honest evaluation and taken whatever action it ultimately requires. Whether that action involves continued patient investment based on genuine evidence of primary attachment, direct conversation aimed at producing meaningful change, or eventual departure from a dynamic that has revealed itself clearly as peripheral rather than primary. What remains available is considerably sharper future discernment, a template for recognizing similar patterns considerably earlier in future relationships, protecting you from investing significant time and significant emotional energy into backup positioning, without recognizing it clearly until considerable damage has already accumulated. Let's talk finally about what this entire framework ultimately protects, beyond simply this single relationship's specific outcome. It protects your own capacity to recognize genuine value clearly, distinguishing between relationships that genuinely honor your worth through consistent, primary consideration, and relationships that merely offer convenient, peripheral connection, dressed up in enough genuine affection to make the distinction difficult to recognize without careful, honest examination. This capacity, once developed, serves you throughout every future relationship you navigate, ensuring that whatever connection you ultimately choose to invest in genuinely reflects the primary, central consideration you deserve, rather than settling for whatever peripheral position happens to remain conveniently available. Let's talk about a specific complication worth naming directly. Situations where evidence points in genuinely mixed directions. Some distinctions suggesting primary attachment, while others suggest peripheral positioning, creating a confusing, inconsistent overall picture, rather than a clear conclusion in either direction. This mixed pattern deserves honest acknowledgement, rather than being forced artificially into either category. Sometimes genuine primary attachment coexists with significant avoidant limitation in specific areas, meaning the relationship might genuinely hold primary importance while still requiring considerable growth before it can express that importance consistently across every dimension discussed throughout this conversation. Let's talk about how to navigate this kind of genuinely mixed evidence without either dismissing legitimate concern or prematurely abandoning a relationship that might still hold genuine, if incomplete, primary significance. This navigation typically benefits from continued honest observation, extended over meaningful additional time, watching specifically whether the areas showing peripheral characteristics gradually shift toward more primary patterns, or whether they remain stubbornly consistent despite considerable time and considerable direct communication regarding your own needs and your own observations. Let's talk about what it means to trust your own gut feeling throughout this entire evaluation. Feeling that often registers accurately even before conscious, systematic analysis fully catches up to what your intuition has already sensed. Many people report knowing, on some level, whether they occupy genuine primary or peripheral positioning well before they consciously articulate the specific evidence supporting that knowing. Honoring this intuitive sense, while still grounding it in the concrete, observable patterns discussed throughout this conversation, provides a more complete, more reliable assessment than either pure intuition or pure systematic analysis could offer entirely on its own. Let's talk about what genuine patience looks like specifically, while continuing this kind of honest observation. Patience that differs meaningfully from indefinite, boundaryless waiting extended without any corresponding evidence of movement in the right direction. This patience involves setting reasonable internal timelines for yourself, acknowledging honestly that continued observation deserves a genuine endpoint, rather than persisting indefinitely without ever reaching a conclusion, regardless of how uncomfortable reaching that conclusion eventually proves to be. Let's talk about the specific courage required to act on whatever conclusion this honest evaluation ultimately produces. Courage that matters considerably more than simply reaching accurate understanding on its own. Understanding your position clearly within a relationship, whether primary or peripheral, only genuinely serves you once that understanding translates into appropriate action, whether that action involves continued patient investment, direct communication demanding change, or eventual departure toward a connection genuinely capable of offering a primary consideration you deserve. Let's talk about what remains true throughout every stage of this entire evaluation process, regardless of which specific conclusion it ultimately produces. Your worth was never determined by which position you happen to occupy within someone else's still developing capacity for genuine intimacy. Their limitations, whether avoidant hesitancy affecting an otherwise genuine primary relationship, or genuine backup positioning reflecting deeper, unresolved ambivalence, reflect their own internal architecture, rather than any accurate measure of your own value or your own desirability as a partner. Carry that understanding forward as the foundation beneath everything else discussed throughout this entire conversation, a foundation that remains steady regardless of what any single relationship ultimately reveals about its own capacity to honor you fully. Trust it fully, and let it guide whatever you choose to do next. Let's talk about one final consideration worth holding as you move through this evaluation: the reminder that clarity itself, regardless of which conclusion it produces, represents genuine progress compared to the confusion that likely preceded it. Confusion keeps you stuck, cycling between hope and doubt without ever gaining solid footing from which to make confident decisions. Clarity, however difficult its content, provides exactly that solid footing, allowing you to move forward deliberately rather than remaining suspended indefinitely within uncertainty that serves no one, least of all yourself. And so, if you have found yourself quietly wondering whether you occupy genuine primary importance or something more peripheral within a relationship marked by avoidant inconsistency, trust that this question deserves honest, careful examination rather than continued avoidance, simply because the answer feels frightening to confront directly. Apply these distinctions honestly to your own specific situation. Notice the actual pattern, not simply the hopeful interpretation you might prefer to believe. And whatever you discover through this honest examination, trust that you deserve genuine primary consideration within whatever partnership you ultimately choose to remain invested in. Consideration that reflects your genuine worth, Rather than settling for whatever peripheral position someone else's unresolved patterns happen to currently offer you,